Now I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming to the stage two incredibly talented people, Kate Woodsome and Antonia Hylton. I hope that Antonia, that everyone took an opportunity to have Antonia sign her book, Madness, which is in your tote bag, and Antonia was signing books during lunch. Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum is a phenomenal history that Antonia will describe for us. Antonia, if you don't know already, is a Peabody and two-time Emmy Award-winning correspondent, producer, and author. We're very lucky to have Antonia with us today, and we are equally lucky to have with us Kate Woodsome, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker. Both of these fabulous people are working hard to decriminalize mental illness, and I will step away and let the two of you take it. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello. It's so exciting to be here with you, Kate. I'm a huge fan of your work.
When I first called Antonia to have a pre-interview for this, I think some of the early words were holy moly, because her work is absolutely jaw-dropping, life-changing, and I think history-making. So all of us are in this room today, and anybody listening in the future, we're all being asked to ponder, do we truly believe that all people deserve access to mental health care? And I want to see a show of hands. Don't use we. Do I believe that all people deserve access to mental health care? Raise your hand if you believe it. Okay, the whole room, all the hands are up. So we say yes, society might say yes, but the US social and political system shows that Americans do not believe that all people deserve access to care. It does not believe that all people are equally worthy of care. So how did we get here? Antonia, you're a journalist, a descendant, and a loved one of people who need care. In your work and in your life, what have you found?
Well, I'll start by sharing with you the origin story of this work and the origin of Crownsville, because Crownsville Hospital, the hospital at the center of my book, Madness, is what I've found. And it is a strange and almost unbelievable tale, but it is also a very American one. On March 13th, 1911, officials in Maryland marched 12 Black men suffering with mental illnesses or developmental differences into the heart of the woods on a very cold day in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, right near what we all know now as the capital, Annapolis. And those men did not arrive to find a hospital, a ward, a bed, a place to rest. They found a field and a doctor standing there. His name was Robert Winterode. And he told these 12 men that they now had a new and unpaid job. They were going to spend the next 3 seasons of their lives building their own institution from the ground up. They would clear the forest, move railways, they would construct a foundation and ultimately erect a system of large brick buildings that still stand more than a century later today in Maryland. And when they finished with construction, they were done hammering their own rooms into place. They were marched inside and they became this institution's first patients. It was Crownsville Hospital, formerly Maryland's Hospital for the Negro Insane. And this hospital is the core, it is the heart of Madness. And it is, I think, a story that tells us so much about how the mental health care system in America came to be, the role that Black people played in its creation, and the way that we have treated and viewed people of color in these systems for decades. A place like Crownsville, a segregated hospital, came to be because of a lie, a myth, a story that had been told for decades at that point. Leaders, not just in Maryland, but all across the United States, were debating their different theories of the minds and bodies of Black people in the years after emancipation. And they were writing and noticing in journals and their medical studies that they had noticed that there was an uptick, a sort of surprising amount of struggle and strife in Black communities and neighborhoods in the years after emancipation. And they came up with some different theories. The theory might seem obvious to all of us now, why somebody might struggle after hundreds of years of enslavement, but a popular theory that emerged was simply that Black people were fundamentally different from everyone else, that we deserved less care, less funding, less support, and we therefore should be shuttled into, sent to substandard facilities. And Crownsville wasn't alone. There were a number of these institutions all over the United States. But it's this idea that Black people are inferior, that our health is measured differently. In the case of Crownsville, you very much see the connection between the vestiges of slavery, the forced labor of the patients who built their own institution, the only population of patients that I have found in my 10 years of research ever forced to do this. And this story, this idea that for Black Americans, health is going to be measured in your capacity to labor, to contribute, to create, to be a dollar, and that it doesn't have much to do with your rest and rehabilitation. And that's where the story of Crownsville begins. And I argue through the book, which takes you all the way to the hospital's closing in 2004. That is within all of our lifetimes. I demonstrate era by era how the decisions made at that time, the myths that crystallized as this institution was built brick by brick, that continues to affect not just that hospital, but this entire system to this day. And so if you want to understand why our mental health care system works the way that it does, alienates so many of the people that it alienates, you really can't do that without knowing your history first.
And to understand how this myth hardened into a reality, I think it's helpful to look at the language and theory of how it came to be. And so we're going to go to slide 2. Let's travel back to 1851 and the work of a well-known physician named Samuel Cartwright. What was Dr. Cartwright's contribution?
Samuel Cartwright was a physician, a well-known physician, working at the University of Louisiana. And he coined an interesting pseudo-scientific term, which I think is on slide 3. If we can, thank you. Drapetomania, the disease causing Negroes to run away. You laugh now, but there were a lot of doctors, not just Samuel Cartwright, although he was a prominent physician and writer who would debate and send letters to doctors and leaders and slave owners all over the United States. But he was part of a conversation, a belief that emancipation would be a mistake, that actually Black people were so fundamentally different that freedom would cause them to essentially unravel.
Right.
They weren't capable of handling the rigors of everyday life. And that is a myth that may seem, obvious or less surprising existing in 1851. But what you see is that even after Samuel Cartwright is gone, there are physicians who come to work at a place like Crownsville, who found other institutions like Central State in Virginia, who are involved in things like the American Psychiatric Association, whose names are on buildings to this day in our country, who bought into the same myth.
Yeah, so I want to slow us down for 1 second. Drapetomania, as you said, it's the idea that an enslaved person seeking freedom is sick. They must be sick if they want to get away from their slave owner. They're mentally diseased. So if that's the case, then being enslaved is healthy. Okay? So let's go. We've got this definition, we've got this theory for why these Black people who now have freedom, they're going insane. It's because they were healthier when they were cared for by their masters. So the prescription
is more labor.
Tell us about Dr. Stribling and his prescription. And this is a man who was the head of Virginia's, you tell me, mental health commission, the head of Virginia's mental health commission, and a member of the American Psychiatric Association. These are associations that exist today, right?
Another prominent Southern physician who was part of the decision to build Central State, a institution very similar to Crownsville in Virginia. And he essentially came up with a framework, an idea about how we should provide mental health care to the races. It was pretty simple. White people and Black people are different. They should be in different institutions. And health for Black patients means a return to their natural order. Well, when you believe that the natural way of doing things is the antebellum social order, that means that health for Black people will be measured by how much labor they do, how much time they spend outside, their agricultural production. And so you start to see that at institutions like Crownsville. It's not just that they're forced to build this institution from the ground up. What I document through records and oral history in the book is that the patients at Crownsville are then forced to do unbelievable amounts of labor to offset the cost of their own care. Mm-hmm. Something, again, no other group of patients are asked to do in the state of Maryland or anywhere else. They run a massive, highly productive farm. They construct an entire irrigation practice on about 1,500 acres of land. They create and sell rugs, baskets, all kinds of woodworking. They are sent out, again, for no pay, to work on private farms and businesses in Maryland. They are asked to do wartime assistance during World War I and World War II. And again, they receive no pay for this. Mm-hmm. But they're told this is their therapy. Mm-hmm. And anyone who's studied these systems knows that mental institutions have long had work programs, internships, apprenticeships, that you could find a job when you were rehabilitated. The idea was you would, through having a trade, like becoming a carpenter, that would make it easy for you to come back home, come to society. But that's not what we see in Crownsville. These were not opportunities for jobs. There was no one who was going to write you a reference and help you get back home. This was purely about what you could do to help make money for the state of Maryland. And you see this decision affect the hospital even after they stop forced labor, which they stop in the late 60s. But because for decades, this place opens in 1911, the 1960s, not until the 1960s that they stop doing this to patients there. The state lawmakers have grown accustomed to not paying very much for Crownsville because the patients are running the asylum. Mm-hmm. And so they don't want to fund it the same way they're funding all the other pure white institutions. And then when the hospital starts to struggle because the funding's not there, and the neighbors are worried about riots or escapes, they then push to fund very carceral measures. The community wants to build a wall around Crownsville at one point. They want to add more locks and chains, and they don't want to pay for therapists and more doctors. They don't want to increase employees' salaries, that people feel cared for and want to keep working at this institution. And so over time, even as the place starts to look less and less like the slave plantation it was in those very first years, mm-hmm. the decision to set up the hospital and to treat that hospital that way erodes its capacity to provide any kind of therapy. And it creates a place that is much more intent on incarceration.
It's not an easy history to hear, and I'm imagining it was even harder to uncover, with so much of it being whitewashed. How did you uncover this? How did you get the files and the histories?
Ooh, well, it was a process, but it started actually as a very personal thing. Mm-hmm. I come from a family with a history of mental illness, and I grew up hearing the stories of my great-grandfather who was sent to a segregated ward of an institution in Michigan. I grew up seeing my father struggle because his first cousin, mentor, and good friend had been killed by a police officer in the midst of a mental health crisis on the steps of a federal building in the 1970s. And my father had lost one of his best friends and really had never been able to talk about it and process that. And then while I was doing the work of this book, a loved one in my immediate family was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And we were trying desperately to find this person care in the midst of the pandemic. And it was really, it was horrifying to see some of the parallels between our current moment and what I had uncovered in the records all the way back to 1911. And it had been a fight, because I think the people who knew what was in these files in Maryland, they didn't want them out there.
What were some of the parallels that you're seeing today?
Well, my loved one at the time, back in 2020 and 2021, was having a delusion, a hallucination that they were being hunted by a group of white supremacists. And all of the events, the pain that I think everyone was going through at that time, but certainly the Black community was going through after the murder of George Floyd, all the way up to the events of January 6th. My loved one kept trying to find psychiatrists in the state of Massachusetts who would talk to them about race in America, who would help them process these fears, these nightmares, these visions that they were having. And they kept being told by doctors that that wasn't really what's at issue here. And I was so shocked by that when my loved one would call me and tell me this doctor does not care about the fact that I'm Black. I thought they were lying, to be totally honest with you. I thought, okay, well, they've just been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Maybe they're not telling me the true story of what these interactions with their doctor's been like. I'll go and visit them. So I go to this institution in Massachusetts, and I was crushed to find that my loved one had 100% told the truth. Their care team was all white. When my loved one tried to talk about what January 6th meant to them, their fear of extremist movements in the United States and what that might mean as a Black person in this country, their doctors did not want to have that conversation. And it's painful enough as it is to just describe that kind of isolation that my loved one was feeling. But what this really meant was that their recovery was shattered. Their trust in our medical system was shattered. It would take my family years to get them to find good care, a clinician, a therapist who they could trust again. Those interactions set them back. And this is a family, I come from a family with good health insurance. We had the money to pay for them to be in an inpatient facility and to get support, and we couldn't find it. And so it made this story, this work around Crownsville, that much more urgent for me, frankly, because I realized if my family can't do this, almost nobody can. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that we can chart a better path forward, that we can make sense of this moment without our healthcare workers and the people who are dedicated to this space really understanding where this has come from.
I think a really important part of your book, and is where you start to talk about the integration of Crownsville. When Black workers began to be employed by Crownsville, even cleaning, Black cleaners would begin to care for the patients in a way that they had never been cared for before. What are the lessons from then that must be applied today?
Well, in a way, it is a complicated, painful, and messy process integrating these institutions, but it is also actually a very beautiful one. Mm-hmm. And I've met the most amazing people, many of whom are in their 80s and 90s and still living in DC, Maryland, and beyond. And they come into this institution that for decades had barred them from serving their own community because of these myths. In fact, in one chapter, I was able to get my hands on the transcript of a conversation between a Black reporter pushing the head of the mental health care system in Maryland over the phone about his refusal to integrate the hospital. And the guy running these systems tells this reporter in the late 40s that he doesn't believe that Black people know a thing about the care of their own race. he doesn't believe that they're qualified to do this work.
Yeah.
And he says that on the record. So a few years later, integration begins, and these Black employees, mind you, are in they're teenagers or in their early 20s. These are their first professional jobs. They are coming in and they are groundbreaking pioneers, but they are also subordinate to people who had been at this institution for a long time, and who wanted things to stay the way that they were. And there are all these tender, weird, and funny moments in those early years, because those employees who've been told for decades that they're not worthy of doing this work, they're not qualified to be doctors, nurses, or even aides, they come in and they find that the people who had been working there weren't properly keeping reports and records on the patients. They weren't cleaning wards, so they came in, and all of the employees describe memories of this smell hitting them in those early years. And that they then would notice after the smell, they would see that there was feces all over the floor, that no one was washing or combing the hair of patients. So they were sitting patients down on the floor between their knees, and for the first time combing out their curls and braiding up their hair. Work that they weren't being compensated for, weren't asked to do or supported in, but that they realized they had to do to bring some humanity into this place. And over time, the hospital, the staff becomes less and less white, many of them fleeing this institution because they don't want to work with these new healthcare workers. And there's this fascinating moment where it becomes almost a community institution. And all of these women and men are coming in, and it's not this skin level, surface level diversity. These are healthcare workers who go to the same schools, same churches, live in the same neighborhoods as their patients. They rode the bus to school with them. They know their moms. They're able to call home and reconnect them. And so there's this window from the late 60s to the early 80s where really becomes an all-Black institution. And you start to see a glimpse of something that we had once been promised would happen around the country, community mental health care. And they're coming in and they're doing the work, and they're doing what they can to protect their patients from all of the outside forces that had so pressured and depleted this place. And so what I learned from those people, I think that their story, their resilience, their willingness to work at a place like this for decades, really to me, their example points the way. I think what's missing from our mental health care system right now is any sense of community. It is that connection, that love, that care. I hear every day from readers, from healthcare workers who want to be that person, but feel like everything about the system constructed around them is making it impossible for them to be that person. And we're not really providing people mental health care if that's not present. And I think that's the major lesson that I learned from those men and women, because even after the institution closed down in 2004, and they saw their patients deinstitutionalized, sent back home to the community while they were living under bridges and overpasses in Baltimore and Annapolis. Many of them were getting picked up by police officers and sent to jails and prisons instead. And these men and women, for again, no pay, start going out into the neighborhood, checking in on their patients, doing what they can to help them. During the pandemic, some of them who were quite elderly were packing COVID masks and snacks and bananas and socks and warm clothes into cars and driving to where they knew patients they hadn't actually technically been assigned to work with for almost 20 years were. They went and found them and gave them what they could. And to me, that just provided so much encouragement, such a reminder to me that at a time when I think so many people are desperate for these services, but extremely disappointed with where the system has landed in our country, that at least for me, there's really no excuse to not get up tomorrow and try again, to try to help the people who I know and I have access to. That community, that love is clearly the path forward. And I think that's the major lesson of this book.
I want to open it up to questions. And while we're waiting for people to come to the mics, there's one on the left and on the right. I'm going to ask you where in this is hard work. It's personal work, it's professional work, it's hard work. Where did you find and continue to find the joy that keeps you going?
A few places. The community that I got to know and whose stories I got to tell in this book, they are going to be with me forever. Some of them have become like my own parents and grandparents, to be honest with you. It's unlike any other source relationship I've had as a journalist, because you spend 10 years going into people's homes. They start to see you as someone who's going to be invited to all the barbecues and cookouts. And
did you ever think I shouldn't be friends with them? How did you?
Yeah. But also by the time the book was done, you kind of have to surrender and let go.
Yeah.
And also, this was always going to be a very different project than anything I had done before. The reason that they trusted me to tell their story was because they knew about my family, about my lived experience. Yeah. It was because they knew I actually cared. One of the things that, most, I think, actually shocked me by the time this book was ready to come out into the world was I reflected on the fact that when I first started calling all of them, I was just a teenager in college. I was 19 years old.
Guys.
And I was a 19-year-old calling former doctors and administrators and patients of this place saying, hey, would you talk to me? And of course, I probably thought at the time I was doing a great job. But when I look back at it now, I'm like, they actually wanted to talk to a 19-year-old about all this? What were they thinking? But they spoke to me because no one else had asked.
Yes.
And mind you, this is a community that's right in the midst of Annapolis and Baltimore. There is the Baltimore Sun, there's the Washington Post, there's the Capital Gazette. Mm-hmm. There are unbelievable award-winning journalists working at all these places right by Crownsville. It's right under their nose. The place closed in 2004. Yep. I shouldn't be the first person to write about this. If other people had been doing their job and who cared to listen to Black people talk about what these systems have been like for them, I wouldn't have had anything to do.
And not only were they absent, you detail in the book, they were absent, but in the rare occasions where the Washington Post or the Baltimore Sun, predominantly white newspapers, were covering Crownsville, it was through the lens of whiteness and through the lens of this myth. And so the language that was used to tell the stories were in service of the myth.
Yeah.
So you were correcting the record. There's a gentleman here with a question.
Hi there.
My name is Travis Atkinson. And first of all, Antonia, I can relate to you. I've also had a family member who was institutionalized in the state of Michigan. But this action that you described of these service workers at the hospital doing something completely different than their job, to me, that's agape. That is doing something for someone that you hardly know, but you know it's the right thing to do to care for people. We've seen this so many times in the crisis system where folks like Edwin Schneidman with the National Suicide Prevention Center in California, to the Soteria studies, to the postcard studies, people are pouring themselves into these systems to make them better. And you describe a broken system as well, which I think resonates with a lot of us here. I'm curious what you believe are some of those solutions to make space for more people like those service workers that you described to be able to express the love that might be either dormant in their hearts or just doesn't have an outlet in order to be as helpful as they want to be.
I think one of the key solutions is to professionally support and to pay these people what they deserve. I spoke to so many healthcare workers who described to me feeling like in order to save their patients, in order to get people out of Crownsville and back home, that they were almost like taking parts of themselves, picking apart pieces of their own soul to fill someone else back up, to make them whole again. That there was almost no way for them, with the little pay they were getting, the lack of the support, the constant criticism from the press, from the state of Maryland. They seem to never be able to do anything right. The goalposts are constantly moving on them. So the only way to actually save someone was to take away parts of themselves. And I think there are obvious professional supports that those people deserve, and that, frankly, I think our leadership, our lawmakers at the local and national level actually know what these things are, but just refuse to pay for them. I think the other piece is that people need to remember that a lot of these systems, or all of these systems, are incredibly interconnected. And so whenever people ask me when I'm out on the road, what can I do to help, or what could I vote for? I tell them that research shows that investing in public schools is good for mental health. Research shows, thank you. Research shows that having spaces where kids feel safe, like they can explore, like they can make mistakes without being surveilled, that these are spaces that nourish their mental health and their resiliency. And if you invest in those things, you're going to pay a lot less on the back end. And it's helped me reframe some of the other issues that I cover as a journalist too. I spend a lot of time at NBC covering book bans and the removal of certain history lessons from our schools. And I now have seen it in a different light that's less about just the First Amendment and people's right to read books, but if the research shows us that people having access to these community materials is a key part of actually their health and their well-being, that kids, especially of color or LGBTQ kids, knowing their value, their history, why they matter, what's their context in this country, that's something that is a protective factor, a supportive factor, then when someone wants to take that from you, what are they doing? This is more than about just the stories we hear and we're told and the books we get to read. It's about our health, our survival. And so I've tried to reframe these things so that people feel not like they're being crushed by this tsunami and there's nothing they can do, no voice they have in it. There are actually all these interconnected public goods and supports that if we rallied behind, we showed up and we used our libraries and our parks and we backed our public schools, that's a small way that you're actually supporting the people who are working in the system too.
And that's a great segue to our next question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Hi, Ms. Hylton.
Hi.
Hi. Excuse me. I have two questions. The first is, I'm actually from Maryland and I went to an HBCU and I have never heard of Crownsville.
Wow.
So my first question is, how did you come upon Crownsville as a place of interest for you, and just the name in the community, period? And then my second question is, during your research, did you find that Crownsville was set up in such a way that it was meant to be experimental, such as the Tuskegee experiment or something along those lines?
So I found out about Crownsville because I came across a short monograph by a social worker who had visited. And she wrote 2 paragraphs about the institution. And I thought, what? I knew about the place that my great-grandfather had been sent, but I didn't realize this was actually a system, that there were a whole lot of these places. Most of them have crumbled, or in the case of the place my grandfather was sent, been turned into Halloween rides and amusement parks, essentially. And so when I found out that this place, not only were the buildings preserved, but the records were saved at the Maryland State Archives, there was a process I could go through, an institutional review board process to get access to them. It was a no-brainer for me. I knew that I could tell this broader story through this one place. And then as I started to dig, I found that for Black families in the Baltimore and Annapolis area, this was a story that they had been talking about, passing on. When I have gone to visit Baltimore for the book, or honestly for other things, I have now had people come up to me and tell me, my cousin, my grandmother, that they spent time in this place. And so it is this massive untold story. And then remind me of your second question.
Did you find during your research that the
experiments?
Yeah.
So there's a chapter about that. I'm guessing most people here are familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks.
Yes.
Her daughter was at Crownsville, and her daughter was part of an experiment performed on about 100 children with epilepsy. And it led to her daughter, Elsie Lacks, dying in the institution at just 15 years old. So while her mother's cells were being harvested and used by science in one way, her daughter, who was unable to speak, unable to consent, unable to call a family member and communicate what was happening to her, was being used by an institution right down the road in another way. So there's a lot missing. I write at one point about how some employees at the institution allege that as they shut down the hospital, they purposely shredded information about past abuses and experiments there. But some information has survived, and so I explore that in the chapter on Elsie's story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tesneem Suleiman. I'm the founding executive director of Blackman Hill, which is based here in Philadelphia, but we service 13 states, and we provide free mental health care to men of color. We center men of color in our mission. And the reason why I started, thank you so much for this. I cannot wait to read this book. I was having like little visceral reactivity while in my body while you were talking, because it is so in alignment with our work, or the why, which I get asked so much, like, why does it exist? And I'm a clinician, so I am like I've spent about 18 years on a direct front line of the mental health care system, literally doing therapy and watching the ways in which providing a safe space of love. When you talked about that labor, I say all the time, our mission is a labor of love. So when we're talking about the labor of labor and how exhausting that has been historically and generationally for people of color and men of color. But when I think about all of the reasons on why our mission exists or why it's so important, that's my personal why of being direct healthcare. But that's my professional. But my personal is I have a nephew who has extreme mental illness, who has been living in the streets, and just every avenue of like brokenness of the system has been subjected to that. And just recently we found out he was in prison, which sadly was a relief, because the years of being spent with him not knowing where he is, or getting calls and having to go get him from someplace, or to find or he almost killed himself, or that he's being stabbed. So to be in this work professionally is very daunting. But then personally, when I get calls from my family and to feel helpless with that, I mean, we've been well through. I mean, I've called 988 so many times, but this is still the reality. And getting the call about him being in prison was still a little bit of relief. We had oxygen. At least we'll know where he's at. At least he's in a controlled setting, which is really depressing to me. And my question to you, Antonia, is how do we help funders to see how important it is to fund direct care mental health care? Because since pandemic, we had a lot of response to what we do around pandemic, and that was because it was
So how do we get
George Floyd.
funders
Yes.
to inject money into this?
Yes.
These vital things.
Exactly.
Okay. So important. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're in this really interesting and kind of strange moment where a lot of people want to talk about and support mental health. They talk a lot about self-care. A lot of people are being encouraged to download meditation apps and to do all these sort of individualistic things to somehow solve our mental health crisis. And I'm not saying I'm against any of those services or programs, but again, if you believe this is a community thing, then there being the funding, the support, and the infrastructure behind it, you likely think is the only way forward. And I think the key, the thing that's missing in the middle there is a constituency. And I think so long as this is perceived as a personal problem, a personal growth issue, something that people individually have to solve or find care for on their own, something where the stigma and shame keeps you from telling your neighbor, your colleague, what you're going through, or what your child or your grandchild is going through, then it's very hard to have a constituency. And I had a historian tell me while I was doing the work on this book that one of the reasons he thought so many politicians saw that after JFK's Community Mental Health Act had fallen apart, essentially, that they could just not follow through on promises that they made. It's because the community of people who publicly talked about being mentally ill was not a valuable constituency, not a constituency that politicians believe they have to do anything for. But I think after the pandemic, we all realize we're all a part of that constituency. It's not us versus them, the healthy versus the unwell. All of us are very much involved in, implicated in, and personally touched by this. How do we then translate that into a place, into a public movement, a community that someone feels like they have to answer to us? That's, I think, the piece that's missing. And the way that this country is set up, the money doesn't come until people feel like they have to answer to you.
We are at time, and so I think part of the invitation is, in reading this book, is to consider, how do I contribute to the madness, and what can I do? And so I would say that, like, we all need to be asking, how do we contribute to the madness? So thank you for helping us see what is actually crazy, right? Which is the system.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so much.